Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and start. I just want to say this is the second concurrent session of the day. And this is Special Education and DJJ Programs with Sallie, Bolton, and Sylvia Starkey presenting. Just a couple of tips before we start. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a chat button that you can hit that will pull up the chat screen, and you can type in questions if you'd like. And there's also, you can unmute yourself if you need to chime in or ask a question. We just keep everybody muted because we get a lot of feedback and it can mess up the presenter. And also at the top of the Zoom screen, I think is where you'll find it. You can choose different views for the video. And if you choose speaker view, you'll always be able to see the person speaking as well as their presentation. So that is just a couple of tips before we start, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Sylvia.
Hi, how are you guys? No pressure on you can see your presenter the whole time they're presenting. I'm just kidding. We're used to it. But I'm super excited that you guys have me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about about special education and DJJ facilities and how to do IEPs and all of those things. If you were at the Title I Part D meeting earlier this week on Monday, this is a repeat of that session. So if you have already seen it, then I totally will not be sad if you move on and do something different. But I wanted to make sure you guys knew that before, in case you had already seen it, so that it wasn't a surprise. Why is it not working? Part of this, oh, there it goes. Okay. Part of our presentation will be using what's called Poll Everywhere. If you've never used it before, I've got a QR code and you can scan it from your cell phone or your iPad. You can also text this code at the bottom. It's Starkey 738237607. Those directions will appear on the slides again if you miss the QR code that we're putting up now. But also, keep in mind that I'm totally fine if you'd prefer to answer through the chat if you're more comfortable with that. So that's fine too. So if, when we put in questions, feel free to answer either way. Both of those are helpful. We're just trying out something new to see if it's a little bit more engaging. It kind of gives us some results that everybody can see. So we thought that might be helpful for you while you're working. It looks like there's a question in the chat about, could you get a copy of the presentation at the end? I have sent that to Sallie. And so I'm totally fine, Sallie, if you're interested to send it to whoever's here today. We're happy to share.
I'll make sure everybody gets it.
All the information that you need.
Okay. I'm taking names.
Perfect. Okay, so the first question that we're going to have today is, how knowledgeable do you feel like you are about providing special education in a non-traditional environment? So when we think about non-traditional environments, that includes anything that's not a traditional school setting. So that would include DJJ facilities, group homes, any kind of facility that you may work in. Take a second and think about that. Do you feel like you've got it? You know exactly what to do? Do you feel like you know what to do, but sometimes it gets a little hard? You're still learning, but most of the time it's hard, or you're pretty new at it and is it not working? Activate. Okay, should work. That sometimes that you're new at it and it's really still a lot to learn.
Sylvia, you might want to put your presentation on full screen.
Is it not showing on mine? It's showing it full screen.
No, we just have like the PowerPoint view. Weird. It might just be you need to pick a different screen when you're sharing. If you have two monitors or something like that.
Let me try that. Hold on.
It can get tricky when you're screen sharing on Zoom.
Is that better?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. I appreciate that because I thought I was sharing it, but it got all messed up.
No problem.
So I appreciate that. Thank you for telling me.
No problem.
So, and then I lost my chat when I did that. Let me pull that back up. It sounds like most of you guys are somewhere kind of in the middle where it's new, you feel like you understand it, but it can get a little confusing at times. There's some stuff that, you wish maybe you knew a little bit more about, or some of the stuff in a facility is a little bit more difficult. And I would agree with you that when you first start to get to this information, it's a whole lot all at once. Why is it doing that? There it goes. Okay. But it looks like there are several of you too that say, I feel like I know what I'm doing, but sometimes it gets a little bit hard. So you'll see that's, some of the answers that you've got as well. So let's talk a little bit about what is special education in the first place. So when we talk about special education, it's really about specially designed instruction, which is provided at no cost to the parents, and it's meant to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, which includes instruction in the home, in a regular classroom, in a hospital, in an institution, any kind of other situation or setting. It includes things like speech language pathology services, travel training, vocational education. All of that is inside the Kentucky Administrative Regulations, and there's a link to what that is in the definition of special education. It's important for us to think about, why is special education important? And really the answer to that question is that, special education is more than important. It really is an individual entitlement act, right? So it's the student's right to receive those services. And it's really important that we provide them in an appropriate setting, and that we give them everything that they're able to do in order to maximize their potential and their educational benefit, and for us to really help to provide them with everything that they need while they're learning. Of course, it's not going to work again. There we go. The crux of special education is a free and appropriate public education. So when we think about a free, appropriate public education, that really, we call it FAPE, but it really spans all the way from when they're age 3 to when they're age 21. And it's for all students who reside within a district's boundaries who have not received a high school diploma. And it includes kids who have been suspended or expelled for more than 10 days in a school year. And it's important that districts provide FAPE to every child with a disability, even though they haven't failed or been retained, or they're advancing grade to grade. That really comes into play when we talk about child finding a little bit. So districts have a responsibility to find kids. So just because a kid advances from grade to grade doesn't mean that they don't need special education or related services. But districts, LEAs is a local education authority. We use a lot of acronyms in special education, but they're not required to provide FAPE to a student who is 18 or older who is placed in an adult correctional facility if in their placement prior to that they were not identified as a child with a disability and they didn't have an IEP. So a good example of this is a student who was a senior in high school, 17 years old, maybe a senior in high school, and didn't have an IEP in the district, but then maybe ended up in an adult correctional facility and turned 18 while they were there. You would not have to provide them FAPE if they didn't have it in the high school before. So even if they had issues and you thought maybe they were in need of special education, you're not required to provide those services at that point. A really important thing I want you to just remember, and there's a link to it, and I would encourage all of you to really dive super deep into it. But it's called a Dear Colleague letter, and it was written around the provision of special education within correctional facilities. And it really, the basis of that document just talks about how IDEA protections, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, protections apply to students with disabilities in correctional facilities and to their parents. And it really lays out all kinds of things that you need to be thinking about, things that facilities can do, challenging, situations and things for you to think about while you're there. So I would really encourage you to, take some time, click that link and really read through it to see kind of all of the things in it, but we'll hit some of the high notes in this presentation. So nationally, reports document that approximately 1/3 of students who were in juvenile correctional facilities were receiving special education services. And if you look at it more in terms of individual facilities, you'll see that it ranges anywhere from about 9% on the low end to 78% across, jurisdictions. And that's a huge, difference. But we can assume that about a third of the students that are coming through any kind of juvenile correctional facility are getting special education services, but it could range as high as 78%, which is 3/4 of your population. So we know that there's definitely a need for, developing knowledge and doing things. There's lots of challenges that you guys face, including overcrowding, frequent transfers. We know that sometimes a kid is there for a couple of days before they move somewhere else. And so that causes issues. And particularly when you're thinking about frequent transfer issues, some of the things that we hear all the time are just yes, we're having all these transfer issues, but also we can't get the IEP from the people in front of us. And we can't figure out why we can't get that from them. So it'll be important for you to think about how to share documents between, local places. We also know that there's, challenges that include finding qualified staff who are willing to work in the facility. And I hear a lot, not so much from the district, which I'm sure that won't surprise you, but I hear a lot from correctional facilities, how there's just a lack of collaboration between the facility and the local district. So sometimes you'll hear them say, yeah, they provide us with trainings. And the district's well, we train them. It's great. We send them to everything. But what we hear back from you guys is well, yeah, they invite us, but it has nothing to do with the challenges we're facing. We really don't learn anything. It doesn't address the situation, or, the strategies that they provide work great in a traditional environment, but they would never work in a correctional facility. And so it's really challenging for you to get the information that you need, to have all the, all the stuff that you could possibly need to talk about in those areas. So we know that those are all challenging. The letter also goes on to talk about how, the provision of special education is really a shared responsibility. This is a huge question that we get all the time, is who's responsible for providing special education? Is it the local district? Is it the facility? Is it the department? Who is it? And it really is a shared responsibility. And the letter will go on to tell you that every agency that's involved in the provision of special ed and related services to students in correctional facilities has to ensure FAPE, even if other agencies share that responsibility. So, one of the things that comes in and happens sometimes is if your facility was to be monitored, we would look at both of you and say, okay, well, how did you ensure, district, that those things were happening? And facility, what were you doing to ensure that was happening? Because you guys both really shared that responsibility. And so those things would come up in a situation like that. It also talks about discipline and how students with disabilities in a correctional facility who violate a code of student conduct, they're still entitled to all the protections of the IDEA, and that those protections apply regardless of whether the student is subject to discipline in the facility or is removed to restrictive settings, such as confinement to their cell or any kind of lockdown unit. Some of the ways that we've seen facilities kind of figure this out is having different situations for different setups for different situations. So when a student with disability is in the school setting, then they're provided with all of the protections of the IDEA. We have to look in terms of manifestation of disability. Was it a manifestation? Are we documenting their things? Did we make sure that we didn't, remove them if it wasn't a manifestation? And all of those things that apply, that those happen during the school day, but after school hours when school's not happening, then we can go back to a different, how we typically do it in the facility, and those things are all okay. So, it's just important to remember that they are still, required to provide those disciplinary procedures. Those are sometimes pretty difficult to provide within your facilities. It also talks a little bit about surrogate parents and how correctional facilities cannot automatically assume the role of a parent under the IDEA. So you can't assume that every child with a disability that is in a correctional facility needs a surrogate parent. So, it's really going to be important for you to, think about the local, whether the parent is involved. Have you tried to contact them? Have you kept a record of all your attempts? Do you even know who they are? Those kinds of things. It's really important that we only appoint surrogate parents when the parent can't be identified. We don't even know who the parent is. We can't locate them after reasonable efforts. And the best way to determine whether those efforts were reasonable is by logging them in the contact log. So any kind of information, anytime you try to get a hold of a parent, making sure that you wrote it down somewhere that you could then locate if someone ever asked you is how you're going to demonstrate that those efforts were reasonable. Reasonable typically includes multiple attempts to get a hold of them. And so it'd be important for you to document, like, I called them at home, or we did some sort of home visit, or we tried to send them a letter. When you're thinking about reasonable efforts, think about how you could provide them in different ways so that you are able to get them the maximum benefit of, we've tried everything and we tried it in a bunch of different ways. We still couldn't get a hold of them. So they definitely need a surrogate. You can also appoint them when the student is a ward of the state under whatever laws that are in that state. So you would look at Kentucky law to see, okay, if the student is a ward of the state, then we could give them a surrogate parent. Or if the student is an unaccompanied or homeless youth as defined in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So those would be the areas that you got a surrogate parent for. Surrogate parents can represent the student in all matters that are related to the identification of a student as a student with a disability. So if a student was referred or felt like they needed to be referred while they're in your facility, that surrogate parent can represent the student in that matter. They can also represent them in terms of evaluation. So making sure that the student is evaluated and that they sign off on the evaluation measures. They can act as they represent the parent in terms of placement. Placement is really about, like, how much resource do they get in the day, and then the provision of a free and appropriate public education. So when you're a surrogate parent, when you're representing that student, that also comes with, they're able to, file dispute resolution on behalf of the student if they can't come to an agreement, all of those things. Surrogate parents must meet requirements for the knowledge, skills, and impartiality. So it'll be really important for you to document how you did all those things as well. So all of those things are really in that. Those are kind of the high points of that Dear Colleagues letter. But like I said before, I would really encourage you, if you're working in one of those facilities, to know what that document says. And this PowerPoint, when you get it, will provide you with a link to that so that you can get it straight to the source. So let's talk about just kind of special education basics today. And if you all have any questions, feel free to stop me. I'm having trouble seeing the chat right now. So if you feel, feel free to jump in at any point and just interrupt me. I don't mind at all if you have any questions. So, in terms of child find, we talked about a little bit earlier, but it basically requires districts to have policies, procedures, and practices to help identify, locate, and evaluate kids in their district who may be in need of special education. That child find is in place to evaluate kids from 3 to 21 who reside within the boundaries of that district, and includes highly mobile children, which I think is really important for you guys, because some of your children are highly mobile, and a lot of times what I hear from facilities is like, these kids get to us and it's like nobody ever noticed that they should have had special education all along, and they show up here and nothing's ever been done. So it would be prudent upon you to put that kid into the referral system, go ahead and start to plan for an evaluation and get all of those things, in order, and to contact the district and say, hey, listen, we think that this kid should be led, and we've got to get that started. And, once you get those things started, they can kind of transfer with the student. It also, when we talk about IEPs, or Individualized Education Programs, we have to, the district is responsible for making sure that the IEPs are developed and implemented for every child with a disability that's served by that district, and for all of them that are referred to a private school or a facility by the LEA. And at the beginning of the school year, you need to make sure that each kid with a disability that is eligible for special education and related services has an IEP in effect, and that IEP is in effect before you provide any kind of instruction, specially designed instruction or related services to that student with a disability. And then it's also important to remember that IEP should be implemented as soon as possible following an ARC meeting. An ARC is an admissions and release committee meeting. So if there was to be a meeting and changes are made to an IEP, it wouldn't be appropriate to say, okay, well, like, we're going to wait a couple of weeks until we get that in place and then we'll implement it. It's really important for you to remember that you should start implementing that as soon as possible. And so you should really start it like immediately. If there's any kind of, staffing changes that have to be made, those kinds of things we can think about, but we can't use anything like administrative convenience, like hiring or anything to say that we're not going to implement an IEP. So you'll just do the best that you can while you're doing those, and then, provide them as compensatory education if you can't do them right away. IEPs have a whole lot of requirements, and we'll go through each one of them individually. But the main requirements is that they have present levels of academic performance. There's a section for consideration of special factors. There's a section for, measurable annual goals and specially designed instruction. And then there's a service for any kind of supplementary aids and services that the student might need. When we talk about present levels, a lot of times you'll hear us call it the PLEP, and we call it, it's actually called the PLAF, but we call them the PLEP, present levels of academic and functional performance, but you'll hear a lot of people refer to them as PLEP, present levels of educational performance, which kind of includes academic and functional within inside of it. So, present levels are required to have a summary of the information and data that documents what the student currently knows and what they're able to do. And the intent of present levels is really to provide the ARC with a baseline of the student's strengths and their needs. I get a lot of questions about strengths because they're like, well, what if the kid doesn't have any strengths? I think it's okay to talk about their relative strengths, right? So maybe it's not like a strength, but relatively compared to their situation, this is something they're doing well with. It'll be important to really think through to say that there is something that they're doing well, and to find out what those things are, even if they're relative strengths. Present levels really provide us with a foundation on which IEPs are built, and they provide the basis for generating measurable annual goals. They provide us with a basis for developing specially designed instruction and supports and services that help us to meet individual student needs. They're really just that foundation of a house. So if I think about how I build a house, I build the foundation first. When you're developing an IEP, it's going to be super important for you to write present levels first, which I know what I'm saying when I say that. I was the teacher that used to write them last. And now I know that was like a terrible idea and none of them ever aligned, and I couldn't figure out why, but this is why. If you build your present levels on what the student knows and is able to do, then we can then build from there to see, okay, what's our next step? So if I know where they are now, then I can figure out where to take them next. So it's really important to write those first. And it's very important that there's a direct relationship between the information in that section and the measurable annual goals and any kind of short-term objectives, benchmarks, and accommodations in the rest of the IEP. What we see a lot that's an error is we will see how nothing aligns. So there'll be an IEP written and the present levels will go on and on and on and on and on about how the kid really struggles with instruction and they hit other people and they have trouble with, paying attention in class, or, they struggle in math, or all kinds of information about how this kid is struggling. But then when we get to, the measurable annual goals, there's really nothing there to address those issues. So anything that you bring up as like a weakness in the present levels should really drive how you build your goals. So when I build those present levels, here's what they know they can be able to do. They struggle here. That drives my measurable annual goals. My measurable annual goals then drive my instruction, which then drives my supplementary aids and services, which then drives how much time they get, which then comes all the way back to evaluation. And we go, here's their evaluation, here's where they're at, here's their present levels. And it's like a cyclical circle. It just goes around and around. Each thing informs the next thing. So if you're not using them now to inform each other, think about how you could start to implement that, because when you start to do those things and see how they all align together, that's when you become really able to really write powerful IEPs that maximize benefit for students. So we always encourage you for those things to elapse. When you're looking at present levels and you're writing them, it's important to think about the differences between vague and specific phrases. A lot of times what we see in present levels are very vague phrases, like they don't speak clearly, or they don't follow directions, or they're weak in reading, or, you know, they are active, they don't pay attention, they have difficulty following classroom rules. It's better to write a more specific phrase, such as he speaks in one or two word utterances 90% of the time, or he's able to follow classroom rules using visual cues 80% of the time. He reads 45 words per minute on grade level text. So if you look at the differences between these two on this slide, what you'll see, the biggest difference is the data that's included. If you look, there's specific numbers. You can see exactly where that kid is. They took data on it, and they can tell you exactly what it is. It will actually help you to build your goals later, because you know exactly what the problems are and how you can address them. When we're thinking about consideration of special factors, that's the section right after the PLEP. It's important to remember that it's not just a checkbox, and that it really should align with the present levels. A non-example of that is if the present level clearly states there's an adverse effect in the area of social emotional, and the considerations of special factors don't identify that behavior as affecting the education to self and others, you would expect those two things to align. So basically, like the PLEP came out and said, you know, Johnny really has difficulty following directions. He hits everybody. He's not paying attention. He's constantly rude. He doesn't, you know, he cusses, or he does whatever it is that he does in the classroom is problematic. But then we'll go to the consideration of special factors, and it says the student's behavior impede themselves or others, the education of themselves or others, and they'll check no. Those two things don't align. So making sure that whatever you do, that it's aligned across both. So if you say that there's issues, then you would check yes, there are, and then figure out how you're going to address those behaviors, whether it's in a behavior intervention plan or however you're going to address it, especially design instruction, those kinds of things. The next section are measurable annual goals, and we talk about them as if they're the alphabet. We talk about them as an A, B, C, D, E, F. So when you're looking at measurable annual goals, you'll ask yourself, you know, who's the audience? The audience is usually the kid's name. So instead of just saying he will, the audience really says, you know, to say Trayvon is going to do whatever. The next section that you're looking for in a measurable annual goal is a behavior. So, you know, if I expand that, it would be Trayvon will, you know, pay attention in class, or will attend to the teacher when they're speaking, or will, you know, complete a non-preferred activity. C is for circumstance. So under what condition are they going to do that? So a good way to think about it in terms of behavior is, you know, preferred and non-preferred activities, or when they're given a prompt, or, you know, in reading, it could be when they're given a prompt that's on their grade level, a passage that's on their grade level, or maybe it's not a passage on their grade level. Maybe it's something that's on their instructional level. So think about what's the circumstance under which you're going to ask them to do that. D is for degree and criterion. So at what degree will they do that? That's where that 80% comes into play. Don't lock yourself into 80%. If a student's evaluation shows that they are only doing, you know, something at 20% accuracy, it's probably not realistic to expect an 80% accuracy rate by the end of one calendar year. So think about how you could differentiate those things. What is more appropriate? E is for the evaluation or method of measurement. How do you make sure that you and I would evaluate it in the same way? I tell people, like, when you're talking about writing, I hear a lot of times, like, as measured by a rubric. Rubrics look really different from person to person. And I could write a completely different rubric than maybe Sallie would write. And when we went to evaluate them, we could come up with very different answers. So when you're including things like evaluations and rubrics that are very judgmental and people do them differently, a great strategy for that is to just attach the one you're going to use to the IEP. So, you know, as measured by a rubric is fine to say, but then take that rubric that you're planning on doing and staple it to the IEP. And then everybody knows this is exactly which one we're going to use. Easy enough. And then the next question is just about, the next F is for frequency of data collection. So are you going to look at that weekly? How often are you going to take the data? So they're going to do it 80% 4 out of occasions. Or are they going to do it every single time? Are they going to do it 3 out of 5? Are they going to do it, you know, 3 consecutive? How do you know when they've mastered that goal? And it is important to, you know, once they master it, to change the goal and meet again and talk about how you can fix it. So, you know, an example of measurable goals, really is put, I put this one on here just for you to see the differences. Sometimes we'll see things like Mike will increase his time on task. Well, like, where did he start? Where are we expecting him to be? How do we know when he gets there? An example of a measurable goal for the same thing is that when Mike is presented with a non-preferred activity and 3 verbal prompts, he will begin working on the activity within 5 minutes on 4 consecutive occasions as measured by weekly latency. So if you think about that, when 2 people are measuring that, it's really clear what exactly I'm looking for, because they're clear on what kind of activity. I wouldn't expect Mike to begin working on the activity when it's preferred. Maybe my expectations are different. So if he loves playing on the iPad and I ask him to play on the iPad, then it's pretty clear he's going to do that pretty quickly with not a whole lot of prompts. But if I'm asking him to do something he hates to do, like maybe he hates reading and I'm asking him to read a passage on grade level, what I'm asking him to do is I'm going to give him a non-preferred activity and 3 prompts before I'm going to start to say that he didn't do it. So non-preferred activity, 3 prompts and 5 minutes, right? So I know that those things are all happening, and that if he does those, then I'm going to count it in his progress monitoring as having happened, and that I'm going to do it 4 consecutive times before I've said that he's mastered that goal. And I'm going to measure it every single week. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use latency recording so I can look up those. And then if you have something like that, if Sallie and I were both doing it the same, looking at those goals, it'd be really easy for us to both come up with the exact same answer. But if you told us to, increase his time on task, it could be very different depending on the situation, how we went about doing those things. The next part is specially designed instruction. And so once you determine that they do need special education and what are their goals, and the next thing you're going to determine is how do we do that? What are we going to teach them? So it talks about, adapting appropriately the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction to address their needs. Put simply, you think about questions like, is your instruction applied to address academic and functional deficits? Does your instruction close the academic gap between a student with disabilities and their peers? That responsibility is really shared between special education and general education staff. It's really that vehicle to ensure that they get high quality instruction that, helps them to progress and leads to, academic outcomes like, better grades and graduation, meaningful post-secondary outcomes, transition, re-entry, those kinds of things. So think about how could you do those? How do you adapt the content so that they're able to, to release it? And put simply, specially designed instruction is what the teacher does to help instruct, assess, or reteach the student. So anything a teacher is doing would be specially designed instruction. Did I adapt my methodology for them? Am I changing the content a little bit? Am I teaching them directly how to do it? So maybe everybody else gets a general overview, but them, I'm going to provide them with a systematic approach, step by step of how do you do a math problem. One by one, and we teach them one piece at a time until they get it. All of those things would be considered specially designed instruction. I'm going to skip this one just in the interest of time. And then when we talk about the next section, it's supplementary aids and services. So those things are aids, services, and other supports that are provided in regular education classes or education-related settings to enable a child with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum. When you put those simply, they're what the student needs to advance towards their IEP goals and make progress in the general curriculum. So let's go back to SDI. Think about how SDI is what the teacher does, right? So any kind of direct instruction, content methodology changes, those kinds of things. Supplementary aids and services, or SAS, are what the student needs. So what the teacher does, what the student needs. Those things get confused all of the time. A good example of what the student needs is like, okay, I can think of a student I had when I was teaching, and the kid really struggled with organization, particularly in general, but in math class, would line the numbers up really weirdly and couldn't figure out how to put them in the right line so that when I was doing my algorithm, that they didn't know that the tens all had to be lined up together. And for her, the supplementary aids and services was as simple as graph paper. If we gave her a piece of graph paper, all of a sudden they lined up because she needed the boxes to help her organize her thinking. And as soon as she had her boxes, she could figure out how to put it. So it can be simple as that. It could be things like manipulatives or any kind of booklet that they need, or does your student need graphic organizers while they're working on their reading passages for comprehension? Are there anything that you're going to give them that they can work with? So when you think about what does the student need, what are you giving them? Are you giving them prompts and cues? Are they, are they getting a visual schedule? Are there any kinds of things that you're, providing them with, schedule changes ahead of time? We let them know before there's going to be a schedule change, or any kinds of things like that. Those would all be considered supplementary aids and services. And we're going to skip that one again. It has not had, I don't know why it's not working. There we go. And then the next section is related services. So special education is one thing, and then related services is in addition to that. So related services includes things like transportation, developmental corrective supportive services. It includes things like speech language pathology, audiology services, interpreting, psychological services, physical and occupational therapy, recreation, therapeutic recreation, early identification, counseling services, rehab counseling, orientation and mobility, medical services for diagnostic or evaluation purposes. One of the things that we see that is the most forgotten about is counseling services. So for students with like high emotional needs, students who have been victims of trauma, who benefit from therapy or counseling as a part of their educational program, because that, whatever they have, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever is causing them to struggle in the classroom, but if we provided them with counseling, they do better and there's less of an adverse effect. That's one of the things I think people forget, that you can write into an IEP and that you can provide for students, is you can write those things into their IEP and say, hey, they benefit from this. Let's make sure they get that. It also includes things like school health services, nursing, social work services, any kind of parent counseling and training. So if there's problems with what's happening with the parent that's causing the student to have adverse effect in school, we can do those kinds of things like parent counseling and training. But it doesn't include medical devices that are surgically implemented, that you don't have to optimize those functionings. A good example of this is like hearing aids. Students with like surgically implanted hearing aids, you do not have to like optimize that device's functioning, map it. The district isn't, the facility isn't required for doing all those things. And then, you still would have to make sure that you can do like outside functions checks to make sure that those things are happening. That's straight out of the regs. Making sure when we talk about IEPs, it's going to be really important when you think about the IEP as a whole to make sure that that is accessible to everybody who works with the kid. So they're regular education teachers, any kind of special education teacher. Sometimes those are similar. Any kind of related service providers, any kind of service providers who's responsible for the implementation of that. One of the things I'd caution you is like any kind of person who provides security during your day. If a student has a behavior intervention plan, which says you're going to maybe respond to them differently in a crisis, you would want to make sure that the people who are responding in crises, who come to provide security and monitoring, are aware of any kind of thing in the student's IEP that would be different. So I know you usually come in and do X when there's a security risk, but for this particular kid, you need to know that we actually do it a different way, and here's how. So just making sure that they're aware of those kinds of things, so that they don't accidentally incorrectly respond because they weren't aware that they were supposed to respond differently. Just making sure you're informing of them and that we are able to provide it. Another thing we want to talk about too is reentry, right? So when we think about providing special education in a correctional facility, it's important for us to think about reentry back into the community, right? So juvenile offenders are significantly more likely to experience a successful reentry if appropriate programs and supports are in place and discussed with that student prior to their release. It's going to be really important for you to plan reentry. It's super critical. and exiting is the most intensive time. So if you are aware of a student who is getting ready to re-enter back into the to the community, it will be important for you to start thinking about how you can prepare an ARC meeting 4 to 6 weeks prior to release is the best, the best case scenario. Start thinking about, okay, we know you're getting ready to release out of our facility. Let's have an ARC meeting and talk about what does that look like and how can we support you, and do you need additional voc rehabs? Do we need to re-up your IEP? Are there things that we provided here that we want to make sure that when you go back to the community or your traditional school that we gave you here that were super beneficial to you, that we can make sure that they give those things to you as well? Do we need to update your IEP? Do we need to include voc rehab? Do we need to include any of those kinds of services so that they're much more likely to re-enter without having to come back again? So those kinds of conversations are going to be really critical. This slide is just to really explain to you all KDE's obligation to monitor compliance in your facilities. So all state and local agencies have to comply with state and federal statutes and regulations. The Office of Special Education and Early Learning has what's called a general supervision requirement under the IDEA. And the intent of that is to ensure that all agencies are complying with that. Because of that, we have a requirement to monitor those things. So there could be a time where your facility is contacted and saying, hey, KDE is going to come and monitor what's happening. We use what's called a focus monitoring. So we won't necessarily be looking at everything special education, but here's the areas we do. I will tell you, in correctional facilities, we really focus on that letter I told you about earlier from OSEP that talks about correctional facilities and how we can do those. We really look at that to provide us with guidance on what we should be monitoring. And so we'll come in and look at folders, typically do a facility tour. We'll ask, some questions, do some interviews, and then a report is provided to tell you any kind of things that, maybe were weird. And the intent of that is really not to punish the district or the facility. I think sometimes it comes across that way, but the idea is really to just help you put in place systems that will grow your facility forward. And how can we help you to ensure things like, if your district wasn't doing a great job of communicating with you, helping you to put systems in place to facilitate that communication, making sure you're invited to ARC meetings so that you can help, to develop plans and do those kinds of things. So any kind of corrective action plan that came out of that is really, really meant to just grow that district. We also, encourage facilities to monitor their own compliance, right? So to start thinking about how they can, develop plans and look at things before we do to make sure, sorry, my kid just came downstairs. So how can you look at your things before we get there so you can correct any kind of error before we get to it? And I think you guys have been doing a pretty good job of doing that, but we would encourage you to just, continue about it. There's a lot of places that you can contact to get support for special education in your facilities. The first one, and this is really the most high level, but we wanted to make sure you have our information, is you can call the Office of Special Education and Early Learning at any point. We're broken down into really 3 divisions, but one of them is the Division of State Schools, and so it wouldn't necessarily really be beneficial for you to call them. That's just the Kentucky School for the Blind and Kentucky School for the Deaf. But there's 2 divisions that would be helpful to you. You can call the Division of IDEA Monitoring and Results. That's my division. And our contact number is at the bottom. It's the same for both divisions if you need to get a hold of them. Anytime of questions about special education compliance would be perfect, or am I doing this right, or how do I do that? We would be happy to answer any questions that you have. There's also the Division of IDEA Implementation in Preschool. They're great at helping you think through how to do some of the compliance pieces. Like, is it compliant is a great question for us, and the how of how to get there is really better for them. I want you to think about how familiar you are with these special education resources as we go through this. But one of the most underutilized resources within correctional facilities are the special educational cooperatives. If you see on there, they're broken down by regions, and each region has its own color. So think about where your facility is located, and feel free to reach out to your special education cooperatives. If you're in Central Kentucky, then you're lucky because they actually have a professional learning community for correctional facilities where they get people who work in correctional facilities together to talk about the specific challenges that are happening within their facilities and how do we provide this, or what do I do? How do I maintain order in my facility while this kid's IEP still says that he needs a break, but if he passes so-and-so, there's gonna be all kinds of stuff that happens, and we don't want that because we can't maintain order in facilities. Those cooperatives are experts at differentiation and can really help you to think through specific challenges that you're facing and how you can get answers to those, or help you think of creative solutions for difficult problems. And I will say that the director of Central Kentucky, KAES, has also said, reach out to your own, regional cooperative and tell them you're interested in beginning a PLC in your area so that they know you're interested in it. But if they tell you that, it's not something they're doing right now, you're always welcome at hers. So, keep that in mind, is that if you are interested in attending KAES, but you don't live in, let's say, Fayette County, let's say I live in, Christian County, which is WKEC, but they don't have anything for us. KAES has said, come one, come all, we'll have you all, and they can do things to help you virtually be able to engage with their community, so that they can help to build teachers and administrators and whoever wants to come to talk about things that are really specific to your population and how you can, type of challenges. There's also some special education guidance documents that can help you. We call it the IEP guidance document. A lot of people refer to it as the IEP Bible. You'll hear them say that. When I was a teacher, I carried it around with me everywhere I went. When I was writing an IEP, I didn't ever write it without looking at that to see, okay, what am I looking for? What does that look through? It actually takes everything we talked about today and really kind of develops it out even further so that you're able to really think through how to develop an IEP. There's a guidance document for students with specific learning disabilities, and so that helps a lot with evaluations and things like that. There's also what's called the IEP and lesson plan development handbook, not handles. And a lot of people refer to that as the schoolhouse document, and the reason they do that is because there's a little picture of a schoolhouse on the front cover. But it is, if you're the differences between supplementary aids and services and specially designed instruction, because it will give by area different ideas for things you could do. So if your student struggles with reading comprehension and you're struggling to come up with ideas of specially designed instruction and supplementary aids and services that you could use, you could look at the IEP development handbook and get ideas for how you could do what you could do. It's really important not to use it as a menu. Don't put everything that's on there because it wouldn't be appropriate, but it will give you ideas of things you could include. And the last one that we have on there on the KDE website is the compliance record review. That's actually the exact document we come and use when we monitor student IEPs. So we use that to develop it. So if you're looking to how to monitor your own progress within your facilities, we would encourage, your teachers to learn about the compliance record review, do one on their students maybe once a year to see where are we at, or if a new kid comes in, to do a quick review and see if there are any things that need to be changed that don't match that. That's how we monitor you. So it's really, beneficial for facilities to use them on themselves to see where they stand. And anytime you find any kind of errors, the great thing about it is you'll get them fixed, and that by the time we come back, we could say the worst that would happen would be like, yeah, there was an error at one point, but they fixed it, so they don't need to do anything else. So a lot of people like that. There's also the State Advisory Council for Exceptional Children, which we call SACEC. It has 21 voting members that are appointed by the governor, and most of them are either people with disabilities or parents of students with disabilities. But their membership includes representation from both DOC and DJJ, which is great because it has really pushed that conversation forward and allowed that perspective to be brought to the table when we're discussing, any kind of advice for, the department. And they meet quarterly. They also have every time that they meet, they have a public comment time where anybody can come and discuss any kind of questions they have or concerns or anything that they really want the department to consider. So that public forum is great for that because it allows them the opportunity to really get their voices heard. So take a second and think to yourself, what kind of supports, additional supports and technical assistance do you need to implement a successful special education program? So, take a second and think about what you could put in, because we'll use that to help us determine, what do you guys still need? What support can we provide you, and how can we get it to you? It'll help, Sallie and I think through what kind of, things we could design for you guys in future trainings. It looks like there's some, somebody asking for project designs for multi-grade levels. I think that's a great idea. Co-ops are great at those kinds of things. So, I would encourage you to reach out to your cooperative because they can help you with that. They're really experts at content and things like that. And it's definitely, I think that's a great thing for us to bring up in future trainings. So thank you for your response. Right now we've got a little bit of time before anything happens. So I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. My information is on the slide and how you can get a hold of me, but you can also contact, her name is Irma White, and she is the corrections lead in our division. And so if you can't get a hold of me, she's a really good person. She's an expert at corrections. She loves it. She's really, really good at helping you think through situations. So she's always available for you to talk to as well. But at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about things. So I'll stick around and feel free to ask any kind of questions that you've got. So, I'll stick around. If you need anything, I'll be here. But if you don't have any questions, feel free. And I hope you have a great, rest of your day. And, just wanted to say again, thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to share, anytime we can get our hands on, talking about special education, we love to do it. So, and feel free to give us with any feedback on things you want to make sure that we address in the future. Because we would love to provide you and support you in any way that we're able to. So have a great day, and thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much, Sylvia.
You're welcome.
And I will, if you will email me, I'll make sure that anybody gets these handouts. I've been trying to watch the comments, but I haven't seen much. So if you have any questions, just email me. I'm on Global, and I'll get them answered for you, and I'll send out this information. Thank you, Sylvia. You did a great job.
Thanks, Sallie.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to let people know that our next concurrent session is at 1 p.m. today, 1 to 2. And then we also have another general session coming up at the end of the day with our speaker, Jerry Brooks. And that will be at 2:15. So just wanted to let you all know that. I hope everybody has a great day and hope to see you back here.